CO2 and doesn't have the ability to absorb as much of the CO2 as you would see here. So of course that's been going up, very strong evidence, direct measurement. And then what's the effect of that? Here's a nice record of the century-long change in temperature of the ocean, which is in blue, and the land, which is in green. And the way climate scientists like to report temperatures, they like to report it as a deviation from the average. So they basically see how much difference it's going above or below the average over the period of the record. So here the period of the record is from 1880 to probably about 2005. So 105 years worth of data gives you an average. So here that would be the zero line, and you can see early in the record, the ocean temperature actually was declining for a period of time, went up for another several decades, peaked in the 1940s, and then kind of came back down for a while, and now it's climbing back up again. And the land is fairly similar, although it's probably on a more steady incline over this early part from 1880s to the 1940s. Had a drop in the 1950s, and then now it's climbed back up. And here we are about 1 degree warmer than we were over that 100-year average. So quite a significant change in the average temperature of the Earth on land. Okay, just checking. All right, so and then finally, the last evidence of climate change that I thought I would show, again, is direct measurement of the amount of sea ice that's in the northern hemisphere. So this is mostly the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean is there's no land mass. Russia and Canada get close to the North Pole, but they don't quite go there. So it's mostly open Arctic Ocean. But it freezes and thaws depending on the cycles. And here you can see the record of it basically not replacing. Each year there's less and less ice. The hatches, the pluses are the data. The dashed line is the trend. So you can see there's definitely a trend downward here. Basically about getting close to 10% of what it was in the 1980s, early 1980s. And you can find other kinds of graphs that looked at ice cover in glaciers around the continents. Same thing would be happening. We're losing glacier ice. The pH of the ocean. So the other thing you have to think about is that CO2 is actually an acid. It forms when it dissolves in water. It becomes carbonic acid, CO3. So it's a weak acid, but it's enough to actually lower the pH of the ocean. So there's actually been a decline in the pH of the oceans from I think it's about 7.8 to maybe 7.7. So it's a small change, but the ocean's a big body of water, so we're actually acidifying the ocean. This is having an effect on coral reefs, especially. Coral reefs are very sensitive to acid conditions. If you get high acid conditions, you just basically bleach out coral reefs, so you basically are going to kill the reefs. So that's basically the kind of the impetus for really the justification for looking at green buildings and focusing, I think, on energy. I could put up other graphs, and we'll be talking about water and environmental indoor environmental health as we go along. But those two would be justifications, use of creating waste. I just take a minute to emphasize too another technical point. Make sure that you get a copy of the book Sustainable Construction by Charles Kibbert. This is required for the course, and there's reading assignments. I realize that some people weren't able to get it this first week, so what I'm going to do is hold off on any assignments for now, but I think next week we'll have reading assignments and maybe some little homework exercises to make sure you're reading and comprehending the material as we go along. All right, so we got a few minutes left here. Let's think now a little more kind connect a lot of these big picture items about climate change and energy down to the green buildings themselves. The book does a nice job of giving you an overview of why green building is important. I think there's a shift in the building industry itself. It's starting to see that the green buildings are the way to go. You can get better prices for them. There's higher demand for them. The U.S. Green Building Council, with its LEED certification, has played a large role in the United States in pushing the industry to make more green buildings. So the business itself is there. If you look at the kind of the ways that things were done in the past, you start with the design and you work with the owner or the developer, come up with what you want to build, how much square footage you want, how many power outlets, and all these kind of hard details about the functionality of the building, but not much about the greenness of the building. And the lowest bid was what won the day. If you come in with the lowest bid, you get the contract, and you're going to make the building. Whereas today, with green building, there's a lot more push to holistic thinking, and it's not so much about lowest bid, but there's a lot of these other skill sets that have to be brought onto the process of going from a concept through design to constructing, all the way through handing the building off to the owner and working with the maintenance crew to make sure they understand how these green buildings operate. The systems are going to be newer to a lot of folks out there on the ground. They have to keep these things going for decades, as well as thinking about now that there's the end of life of a building. What am I going to do with the material that's in the building? How am I going to decommission the building? So going through all these processes, even finance and insurance is going to be affected by green buildings. Issue with insurance is, okay, I'm going to use a green roof. Okay, this is a vegetated roof. It's more combustible material than I'm accustomed to. Am I going to be able to find an insurer who's going to allow me to put a green roof and insure it? So organizations like Green Roofs for Healthy Cities have worked closely with regulators and insurance industry to come up with standards. Look at past systems that were similar to green roofs, for example, and say, well, you insured combustible materials as roofing materials in the past. This is not much different, so we can probably just modify some standard, and we'll be able to do our green roof. Looking at a life cycle, this is looking at the life cycle approach. I think the field of industrial ecology, some people call it construction ecology for buildings. This is a field that's much more mature than it is in the construction industry. Looking at manufacturing, probably about a 15-year head start on the construction industry. So if you wanted to learn more about the principles that are the basis of construction ecology, sustainable construction, looking at the industrial ecology literature would be a good place to start. The other thing, and we're going to be going into more details about this as we go along, working collaboratively across the disciplines. This is where it's nice to have a group of students that I know you have varied backgrounds, and you're not necessarily architects or engineers, but there's a need for people that have a specialization in all these different kinds of elements that are brought onto a green building project that didn't exist in the past. Green roofs is the one I'm most familiar with, but new kinds of heating systems, heat distribution, cooling systems, lighting conditions. So a lot more kind of specialization that's needed today than in the past. Just kind of continuing on here with the impetus for sustainable buildings. It's really an effort in green building to open up the whole process of how you go about making a building. You're picking a site. That site typically has neighbors. The neighbors are concerned about what's going to be put up beside them. The process, the LEED process, encourages developers to bring in those communities and have input from the community early on in the process. So there's almost a democratization of the process of developing sites that the green building is going to improve. This idea of triple bottom line in industry, where you're not only looking at the financials, which is the historic Wall Street, I got to meet my quarterly earnings per share improvement, but adding environmental and social concerns here as things that you're concerned about as a corporation. And how can you be, corporations, of course, they have to make profit to exist, but how can I get credit for doing environmental things? What kind of environmental things should I be doing? Social as well. One of the things we're going to see too is that there's an issue of lots of times the green building has higher capital costs. You're going to be outlaying more money in the beginning, but those are probably going to pay off over a longer period of time than maybe the historical expectation was of the existence of the building. Maybe in the past you thought maybe a 30 or 50-year-old building, and then it's going to be torn down and something else will replace it. Whereas now maybe we should be thinking of 60 to 100 years, and really how long you expect the life of the building to last. So if I make it passive solar and I minimize my fossil fuel consumption down to 10% of what a traditional building is, but it costs me 10 times, 9 times as much early on, but that's going to pay off over a lot longer period of time, so my operating costs should be much lower. So life cycle costing, try to take the whole picture into view to basically justify a financial situation. U.S. Green Building Council, formed in 1993, so that's 18 years ago. Spent its first 5 years with task force developing LEED. Of course, now we think of LEED as just in our vernacular, and everybody in it. A lot of people understand it and know what it's about, but it took 5 years to develop, and that was the first version of it, which wasn't as successful as it is today. So it's actually on its kind of its second iteration, second version today. Are you there? Hello. And it's diversified into all kinds of types. In the past, it was just one LEED. It was for new buildings. But today, you have it for schools and interiors and cores and shells, homes, retail, neighborhoods, and then existing buildings. So these are all other markets where there's a need to do green buildings, and efforts to improve LEED, expand it to cover these. So these are the newer areas of LEED. Okay, we have 10 minutes left, probably about 8 minutes now. So I think what I'll do is I'm make sure that the students have opportunity to ask any questions before we're out of time. So let's pause here, and if anyone